I'm guessing most folks have or intend to edit a manuscript for a journal article. So let's dive a little deeper into what I have for a checklist for editing manuscripts in order to see how you might put together your own comprehensive checklist. So just to begin, I use a manuscript editing checklist because I find that the checklist keeps me on task. It reminds me of the many details I need to check and to track. It makes me, a better, faster editor, writer, researcher, whatever I'm doing at the time, and allows me to track metrics and accurately estimate future projects. Every manuscript is different and every journal is different, so it can be easy to get tripped up by the differences and miss something. So my checklist makes sure I do everything that I intend to do when editing a manuscript. I'll probably have to do a lot of things I don't intend to do, but at least I'll do everything I intended to do. So walking through my example for our manuscript editing checklist, this is the top of one. It contains, to me, essential information about the project, title, which is what's published, a short title, or a running title that might be somewhere in the header of the journal page. And you have to know the journal and where they keep the instructions to authors, if you'll be formatting and submitting the manuscript. I find it helpful to know the journal abbreviation because I use it in my email subject line and on my file folder, my file name, in order to keep all my projects organized. Having the due date on the checklist helps me keep track of the project. I like to track the number of pages so that I can quickly look back at the checklist in the future to gauge future projects, like how long did it take versus how long was it. And as a freelancer, I like to track my hours either because I'm billing hourly or because I want to know how I did in my quote. And I do tend to jump in and out of some of these projects, which is why I have multiple spaces for the timings. Some people use software to track this type of stuff, and I don't judge, but I'm a little old school here. I like to put it all on the checklist. So moving on to the next section, I tend to begin and sometimes end with a run through Perfect It, which will clear out some inconsistencies and get a feel for the abbreviations and, overall start with a cleaner document. This assumes I'm editing in Word on my own computer, using track changes for content changes, but often accepting or not tracking formatting changes. The first page of the manuscript is often the title page, and most author instructions are pretty specific about how they want the author information to look like, what's needed, author names, affiliations, locations. So this section just ensures that I check that the author information meets the requirements of the journal. The next page is often the abstract, which may be structured and look like what I show on the slide, or maybe unstructured, which is essentially a paragraph. If they're structured, they may require the sections to have specific titles and information included within each section, which may or may not match what I have here. But if they don't specify, I can add this for my author as a starting point. Almost all journals have a word limit, typically 250 to 300, though lately I've seen that some that are 150. I'll often just note the word count on first pass, then come back to the abstract again later to try to cut it down once I know what they're talking about in the article. Journals often require keywords to be included, usually 3 to 6 terms you think will help people searching the web find your article. So I check to see if there's keywords required, and then if so, how many, and do we have any? But I definitely have a spot on my checklist to either edit what they have or add something to the manuscript, which I would do and track changes to help them out, and then they can, of course, accept it or write their own. So moving on to the main text, the checklist doesn't actually tell you how to edit when you're reading word by word and line by line. You can certainly add anything you need to the checklist to assist you in editing a manuscript. You can add reminders based on things that you tend to miss as an editor, or you can put in reminders for things that you see that the authors that you work with obviously struggle with. And the next couple of sections are checks for the number of words in the manuscript versus the journal requirements, the number of figures versus the journal requirements, whether the figures are the right format and size, the number of tables versus the journal requirement, whether the tables are the right format. These are all things that I generally help my authors with. And the journals often have specific requirements for the format of the figures, the tables, so these checks ensure that I check them against the journal's requirements. Similarly, journals often are particular about how the figures are provided to them. And when I'm formatting the manuscript and submitting to the journal, I use these checks as part of the task. Likewise, there are often restrictions around how many figures and tables the authors can provide. I've been having to have authors cut those back lately too, I find. So I have checks to count the number of tables and figures and compare them against the journal requirements. There's a lot of little details to be done. This makes sure that I don't forget anything. And then I usually find these sections at the end of the manuscript, so I tend to handle them after I know the main text and I've edited it. But I've also seen some journals ask for the acknowledgments or the conflicts of interest on the title page, so you really have to look at the journal requirements. The references can certainly be a challenging section to edit, so it's a good reminder to look them up. Make sure they follow AMA or the journal's requirements if different than AMA. The supplementary materials, if they have any, they can be extensive, so I have a check for them. And depending on the client, I may or may not edit them. It's really up to them. Sometimes they don't even provide them. If the journal requires the credit author statement, you'll need to make sure it's included. So it has a space in my checklist. Your authors, depending on their experience, may not know about it. So I've included a link to the credit author statement format in the references list, so you can educate them if needed. Even if they don't require that specific credit author statement, the journal might require some other sort of author statement. So if the instructions for authors specifies what the statement should say, you want to follow those. But if there's no format listed and they don't have anything in the manuscript, then it's a safe bet to fulfill the requirement by using the credit author statement. And speaking of acknowledgments, make sure you are acknowledged for your contribution, whatever it may be, assuming it's not your own article, that you're helping somebody somehow. Mine usually say, we thank Kelly Schrank, Bookworm Editing Services, for her editorial services in preparing the manuscript for publication. So if you're a freelancer, you want to add yourself there and track changes so they can approve it. Next up are some reminders to check with the abbreviations used. Some of this can be done or helped with Perfectit, but I still find there's work to be done with this section. The rules cited here are AMA, but of course, change it if you have another house style, you have style guides to follow, the journal instructions are different. This is just, kind of a start for myself or you if you use the manuscript checklist that I provide. And depending on how extensive the author instructions are and how you save and use them, how much their style differs from what's already in the manuscript, the section may not be used, or there may be a lot of notes. You can include or not include this based on how you like to work and how much you think you'll use this section. I often save a copy of the author instructions with my files electronically, but sometimes I also print them and use them as a secondary checklist to make sure I cover everything specific to that journal, especially if it would just make, if I would just fill this whole section with things that are different. Sometimes it's better just to have the original in front of me. And here, this is what I call finalizing the document. I'll run a spell check, another round of Perfectit, then look at it over again from a high level. I don't read every word at this point, but I just flip through the pages to make sure nothing stands out in both all markup and no markup. I'll read through all the comments to make sure that questions were not answered later in my reading, or that I did not decide to make changes to the text instead of just questioning it. And to go through the language again to ensure it's respectful and helpful to the authors. Sometimes I can be a little snarky during the first run through, so I want to make sure I get all of that out of there before it gets to the author. Then I make sure it's saved, and I email back to the author with some notes, but I have little check marks for that just in case. Sometimes I might save it, but I'm not ready to email it back, or just want to make sure that everything's on the checklist documented so I know what's going on. And even though I know I have to do all these steps, having it on the checklist makes it easier to focus on each step without thinking ahead to the next step in my brain. You don't want to be thinking about the whole process and then forget some steps that are in between. If it's all in the checklist, you could just focus on that step with the checklist and then move on to the next step. I just know when I check off one step, I move on to the next, and I find that so much easier. In cases where I'm submitting to the journal, I have a few additional steps in the checklist. I may edit the cover letter if it's provided, so I have that on the checklist. Depending on where I am in the process or my relationships with the authors, I may or may not handle some or all of this. If I'm not handling it for the client, I just put an X there instead of a check mark, so I know that I didn't do it.